Hey everybody, Daniel Fusco here, and welcome to today's 2-minute message. So one of the most unfortunate parts of life, actually it's not that unfortunate, but we don't enjoy it when it happens. That's the idea of when trials happen. And when you think about trials or testings, there's lots of different words that we can use. It's when something is going on that we didn't want to go on. When something happens that is not our preference and we're finding it very challenging. Oftentimes we call this a trial or a test. Now the reason I said that it's unfortunate, although it isn't, is because actually God is always in the midst of all of these things that go on. Now, there's a great story in the scriptures, and this story is challenging for us, but Jesus and his disciples are on one side of the Sea of Galilee, and they've been doing ministry all day, and then Jesus sends them across to the other side of the sea, and Jesus in one of the stories is there in the boat. And in another one, it's a similar type of a story. He's actually not in the boat. And what happens is all of a sudden they end up in a storm and the waves are kicking up and the storm is bad. And in one case, Jesus is sleeping in the boat and the disciples are freaking out trying to stay alive. And in the other case, Jesus is in the boat and that's when Jesus walks on the water and comes to them. But what's interesting about it is that in both scenarios, Jesus sent them right into the storm. Jesus knew what was going to happen. Now, why would Jesus do something like that? Why would God allow a trial? Why would God not keep us from trials? Simply because of this. In the midst of the trial, each one of us learns what's actually in our heart. See, it's by going through something that you begin to see what is in you. There's a story of the refiner and the idea of God purifying us, where a refiner would take a precious metal and would heat it up just enough so that it becomes liquid. And in the midst of that heat, the impurities would rise to the surface so that the purifier could take the impurities out. When we go through a trial, one of the things that God does is he allows us to see the impurities in our hearts, the ways that we lack faith, the ways that we get frustrated and angry, our inability to be able to see the bigger picture in the midst of the circumstances. Just like the disciples, that happens to each one of us. So God wants to show us what is inside of us. Now, if we get back to that story with Jesus and the disciples, whether he's sleeping in the boat, they wake him up and he says, "Why are you lacking faith?" And then Jesus calms the wind and the waves by saying the words, "Peace, be still." And in the one where Jesus finds them, they're in the middle of the storm. Jesus walks on the water. And when he enters the boat, then everything calms down. Now, both of these stories shows the same thing. The disciples end up learning who they are, but then the disciples also learn who is Jesus, because Jesus has promised to be with us in the midst of the trials. That just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the book of Daniel, when they were in Nebuchadnezzar's fiery furnace, they weren't in there alone. There was a fourth person who was in there who was like the Son of Man. Jesus was in the midst of the trial with them. And then you begin to realize how faithful God is and how true to his word God is and how God is the great Redeemer. He can take the most horrific situations and bring beauty out of them. See, God realizes that these struggles in our lives, these trials, these times where we feel like we're being tested are so pregnant with information for us about who we are and who God is. And it's in the midst of that that we begin to learn and grow and see our lives transformed, because when you go through enough trials and you see, I lack faith and God is amazing, then with the next trial that comes up, you say, listen, I know this is going to be hard. I'm going to be faithless, but God is going to be faithful. And then all of a sudden, we begin to move differently through the situations in our lives. So I want to encourage you, if you're in that one of those seasons, struggle, testings, trials, whatever you want to call it, listen, God wants to show you who you are, and he wants to show you who he is, and it's going to be okay. That's what I want you to do. First, I want you to share this message, because all of us have those seasons in life. And in the comment section, I want you to share a story about how God has met you in the midst of a challenging season or trial and what he's done in your life. And we're going to be able to glorify in who God is in the midst of those struggles. God bless you today.